Hello, and welcome to another episode of the series covering each and every issue of the official UK PlayStation magazine. This time we have issue number 2. This issue was released in January of 1996, which means there was actually a month break for December. Editor Steve Jarrett mentions it on the contents page, but he doesn't really give a reason. But hold on, none of that matters because this magazine kicks off with an incredibly bizarre advert for Striker 96, featuring an incredibly domesticated looking woman who's evidently hung herself because her husband has been playing too many football games. I don't think we'd see Kotaku or Polygon running any sort of advert like this. Whereas issue 1's first news story was a feature on the US launch of the PlayStation, which was incredibly successful, this feature is about the UK launch, which was also incredibly successful. Namco's Tekken recently became the fastest selling CD game on any format ever. The title went straight to number 1 in the Gallup CD charts, usurping Destruction Derby, which had stolen top slot from Command & Conquer. Very hard to imagine Command & Conquer being top of any chart. Tekken was the first PlayStation game to ship over 1 million units, and at this time, Sega's Daytona USA for the Sega Saturn dropped off the bottom of the charts. By the end of October 1995, the PlayStation's UK install base had risen to 50,000, a figure which a senior source within Sony told the magazine puts it at least 25,000 ahead of the Saturn. At this time, to further promote the PlayStation, Blockbuster Video carried out a 1-month trial where PlayStations could be rented from them, which cost £6.50 for 3 nights. The next page details the Japanese PlayStation Expo of '96, which took place at Harumi in Tokyo. This was a fan event rather than an industry event, and showed off many games that were coming out in Japan over the next few months. They even held competitions of Ridge Racer Revolution, despite the game visibly still being in pre-production stages. The dedicated Japanese column this month detailed somewhat of a resurgence of retro gaming, which kind of mirrors what's going on today. Retro gaming has always been a popular concept in Japan, although only recently has this wave of nostalgia developed into a bankable concept. Following on from the release of Super Famicom versions of aging, sometimes obscure Japanese coin-ops, Namco is furthering its commitment to rejuvenating its back catalogue of classic titles. After last month's news of its Museum Piece Volume 1 collection, the company now has plans to release another 4 volumes in the series. Amazingly enough, Volume 2 is already at lengthy preview stage in Japanese magazines. Many of these games did in fact come out in the UK, although usually under slightly different names. I believe we have several volumes of Namco Museum, and we also have things like Midway's Arcade's Greatest Hits. So not only did Namco at the time have the highest selling PlayStation game, but it was gearing up to release another very similar title. Soul Edge, which would later become Soul Calibur, had already been released as a coin-op, but was being ported to the PlayStation 1. Here's a bit of news from the US, and please note that EA was actually a really good company back then. Earlier this month, Electronic Arts held a technology briefing at its California HQ. All the top brass presented their visions of the game industry's future, and their findings are good news for PlayStation owners. EA expects the PlayStation to account for approximately 30% of the interactive entertainment market. Good news for PlayStation owners, especially when you consider that this comes from the largest and most significant third-party developer in the world. On the next page is the actual, real and proper Gallup top 10 of PlayStation games, what are on sale now in the shops. From top to bottom, it's Tekken, Destruction Derby, Wipeout, Ridge Racer, Discworld, Striker 96, WWF WrestleMania, Air Combat, Battle Arena Toshinden, and XCOM Enemy Unknown. On to the pre-plays now, which are previews of upcoming games. The magazine said of Ridge Racer Revolution, Ridge Racer is almost perfect, but the one thing that it really needs, the one thing that would elevate it to the level of gaming god was a head-to-head link-up option. Enter Ridge Racer Revolution. The PlayStation sequel has built on the foundation of Ridge Racer and added some of the features found in Ridge Racer 2, the tweaked 2-player coin-op. It also adds a rear-view mirror, some new courses, and was said to be one of the best looking games of its time. PSM got their hands on a preview for Resident Evil. They had very high praise for its graphics and pre-rendered backgrounds, and called it truly the most frightening computer game ever. PSM were also worried that the gore found in the Japanese version of the game, which they describe as glorious, would not make it into the UK version. But this is only the case for some minor details in the cutscenes and not in the actual gameplay. 2 previews from Derby-based Core Design on the next page. Shellshock is a tank game inspired by the classic arcade game Battlezone. You pilot a tank armed with heinous weapons, blow up anything you trundle across, fulfill mission briefs, dodge enemy incursions, and try to stay alive basically. PSM describes the protagonists as a hip and trendy posse, not dissimilar to a rap group, who pop up in rendered animated sequences to propel the storyline and award congratulations on a mission well done. Added to this, the funky rap-based soundtrack and graffiti emblazoned tanks with neon slogans such as "Just Keeping the Peace." This definitely is one game which shouldn't be taken seriously. Next up is a 2-page spread of the game Criticon, which I've never heard of, by developer Kronos, which I've also never heard of. Apparently this is Toshinden meets Tekken with robots, but it does try and stand out in a few ways, such as its rank system, which gives you access to more powerful enemies as you move up the ranks by defeating easier ones. Bullfrog had quite a few upcoming releases, probably due to it now being owned by Electronic Arts, who was probably pushing them to release a game every month or something. Magic Carpet 1 and 2 were both slated for release in this same year of '96, and then there's High Octane as well, which was a racing game based on the Magic Carpet engine. Dungeon Keeper was also meant to come out on the PlayStation in June of '96, however this never happened. Apparently the Magic Carpet engine was a pretty big and versatile thing at the time, as all of these games seem to use it. Here's another one I've never heard of, which looks very intriguing, and at first I thought it was just an early version of System Shock, but no, it's actually an RPG in a similar vein developed by Psygnosis called Sentient. And this game apparently had some very sophisticated dialogue systems for its time, and indeed for the PS1. As one of its developers states, it seemed that what we could do was something much more sophisticated with the game characters, rather than the hollow characters like in, say, Indiana Jones, where if you want to talk to someone you have stock questions and answers. We wanted to build full character profiles for people, so you could talk and say basically what you like. Bolted onto that, you've got to have characters that are realistic in terms of their emotions and their attitudes, so that if you insult someone, he's going to be less likely to help you next time you talk to him. That's really the difference between Sentient and anything else. You can talk to people and they have attitude, they're dynamic as opposed to static. There is no way you can investigate and hold the ship together on your own. You have to persuade other people to help out, and as you talk to them you start to realise that there's more to these characters than them simply running around and doing what they're told. They all have their own agendas. The characters interact with each other, whether you're there or not. Conversations carry on, and rumours and information get passed about, even when the players aren't there to see it. This can have a kind of butterfly flapping its wings effect. There's a preview for Warhammer Shadow of the Horned Rat, which I've played and did not understand in the slightest. I could not get my head around the controls in this game. The magazine states, role-playing games. The term conjures up mental pictures of spotty pubescents peering through heavy-rimmed spectacles, donned in the classic shiny grey anorak, and flares which flap an inch above their white sock-clad ankles. Chortle as we may, this is exactly how role-players were once perceived, but today the attitude towards role-playing is ever-changing and the industry has never been healthier. Yes, I'm sure by this point all the cool kids were playing Warhammer Shadow of the Horned Rat. Now on to the main feature of this magazine, which is an incredibly detailed look into the advent of 3D graphics and all the technical details behind that. I am of course not going to read all of this, I'm just going to read some of the more interesting parts. All you have to do is watch 30 seconds of Wipeout in action to realise the days of pixely sprites have been left in the scrap heap with the 16-bit machines. Everything now is 3D, and games machines live and die by how many polygons they can throw around the screen. Jumping Flash would be just another tired old platform game if it wasn't for the 3D element, and you could argue that if Toshinden didn't have such sexy graphics, it wouldn't have sold nearly so many copies. Now this paragraph alone is such an interesting look into how attitudes around this time were kind of weirdly skewed towards 3D games, as if that was some sort of big revolution, whereas looking back at it now, PS1 and 3D graphics kind of look the worst that video games have ever been, I'd say. Now don't get me wrong, I think that PS1 games look completely fine. I have no problem with its blocky graphics, but to say that 2D games have pixely sprites, it's a bit weird considering that I think some of the best looking games on the PlayStation 1 are actually 2D games. It wasn't until the PS2 with games like Silent Hill 2 and Metal Gear Solid 2 for example, that we could really say that there were any games even approaching photorealism. According to Frank Kitson of Alias Wavefront, in a PlayStation game, the most polygons you'd want a character being generated in real time to be made up of is 500. The PlayStation is probably well capable of doing a lot more, he says, but if you've got 3 or 4 participants in a game, with a fair bit of geometry flying around, you kind of want to keep each character to a 500 poly count. That's a working level. Designing 3D graphics for the PlayStation is a whole different discipline to producing a sequence that's going to be streamed straight off the CD. You don't need to keep your animation within the limits of a CPU's real-time polygon capability. You can do whatever the hell you want. As long as the equipment you're working on can handle it, you can use as many polygons as you feel like. More and more game developers are including luxurious sequences and cutscenes that introduce and frequently interrupt the in-game action. However, they still represent an awful amount of time and effort as well as money. On average, it takes me about 4 months to do an intro, says Bullfrog's Chris Hill, the man behind the theme park intro sequence. If you're talking about one image, it depends on the level of detail you want, but it will probably take you about a week if you're starting from scratch with no pre-built objects. 4 months may sound like a long time, but pre-rendered 3D sequences streamed off the CD are becoming increasingly important to the game industry. And to be fair, more and more games are integrating video sequences into gameplay rather than bolting them on for effect. On the next page there's a pretty large section on shading, which is pretty much the most important thing in getting an object to look realistic, as it's all to do with how light is hitting it. And as we read in the previous issue, the PlayStation made extensive use of garage shading, but it also introduced a lot more texture mapping into games, which of course is standard nowadays. And it's also notable because the Nintendo 64 wasn't really capable of doing any sort of texture mapping due to it still using cartridges and not CD. For this reason and many others, games like Final Fantasy VII, which was originally slated for the N64, moved over to PlayStation, and many multi-platform games had far superior PlayStation versions. Here's a funny one, this new hi-fi minidisc system was worth £1,500 in 1996. If you found this in a charity shop now, it'd probably be worth about £2. So we were talking about beautiful looking 2D games, here's a preview of Darkstalkers. Called Vampire the Night Warriors in Japan, Capcom is hoping to achieve similar success to the fever pitch pandemonium created by the legend that is Street Fighter. Despite the steady increase of interest in this graphically lavish beat-em-up, it has yet to achieve similar status to its predecessor, but Capcom is convinced of Darkstalkers' shining future, and as such, a PlayStation adaptation is already bordering on completion. Over the first 2 issues of the magazine, there's been several comments made about Capcom's ailing fortunes of the time. I would speculate that that probably had something to do with their continual re-releases of Street Fighter 2 over here, Undoubtedly they had a lot of popular games in Japan that never really made it over here, usually beat 'em ups. But as Resident Evil was of course about to hit the shelves, I'm sure their financial difficulties were about to be solved. Phew, that was a whole lot of previews. Next up is the section where the magazine responds to letters from readers. Hopefully there's no one from Leeds this time. Steve Lorick said, "I was very disappointed that Tekken wasn't released on the day. I realise this is probably because they want to give Battle Arena Toshinden a chance to get some sales, but with only one killer app, Ridge Racer, and one good game, Wipeout, there isn't much decent software around yet. Any news on PlayStation Doom?" What's that? You didn't think Lemmings 3D was a good enough launch title? You must be joking. It does seem that here in the UK, racing and fighting games were pretty much the main obsession amongst gamers. Jamie Dunford says, "Cover price $4.99? It's a lot, isn't it?" The people involved in deciding this figure must have been roaring with laughter, thinking about the poor sods who will be streaming out to buy the mag on release. Are you going for an entry in the Guinness Book of Records? I do understand that having the black CDs compiled, mastered and popped onto the front of the mag is leg-stiffeningly expensive, but after all, it is pure advertising for the software companies, so they should be footing the bill to prompt their products this way. I hope it's worth it, and I hope that each month there's going to be a CD on the front, or a price drop if not. And the reply? Why the mag is $4.99? 1. Paper is massively expensive. The price has gone up 30% in the last year, and PSM is printed on some of the best paper you can get. It also has extra inks, the shiny blue in issue 1, which costs even more moolah. 2. PSM has a large 6-person and very experienced team of people, not some spod just out of school or reject from the Games Master TV show. 3. The CD is, as you suggest, stomach-emptyingly expensive. The discs have to be specially manufactured in Austria at the only place in Europe that currently presses black CDs. And think about it, even if we didn't have the CD, the mag would still cost around £3. I have to agree with PSM here, the price of £5, which would be cheaper if you'd have subscribed back in the day, really seems quite reasonable, and they did indeed include a demo CD on every single issue of their magazine. Jason says, "Congratulations on producing a really promising PlayStation magazine. I've got a few questions that I hope you'll be able to answer. 1. The quality of the FMV on your cover CD, Crazy Ivan and Assault Rigs, was absolutely amazing, and so clear that it was better than VHS quality. If the PlayStation can do FMV this well, is there a chance that Sony will start producing video CDs in the PlayStation's own format?" And the reply, "Dunno about better than VHS quality, but it is very good. There's no reason why some entrepreneurial soul shouldn't start producing music video CDs or cartoon shorts. You can store about 25 minutes of PlayStation compatible video on a CD." The next page features a bunch of peripherals, mainly third party, that you could get for the PS1. I don't know about you, but I always thought the point of third party peripherals was that they were way cheaper than the official counterparts. But most of these seem pretty damn expensive for the sake of a turbo button or something like that. On to the reviews now, with the cover game Doom being the main event here. It's a pretty lengthy review with some nice details like artworks and stuff like that in here. Intrinsically, the nature of the game is quite uncomplicated and taps into your deepest primal tendencies, which in turn mutate even the most timid of people into foul-mouthed, gun-wielding lunatics. Die Alien Filth is a familiar battle cry amongst converted doomists, but only during this pixelated burst of escapism, with everything returning to normal once the PlayStation has been turned off. Problem is, it's turning the damn thing off that's the hard part. While in 2018 you'd be hard-pressed finding someone who didn't think the PC version of Doom was the vastly superior version, Doom on the PS1 was actually extremely well reviewed at the time. They gave it a 9 out of 10 and say, "It's easy to see why Doom was one of the biggest games on PC. Compelling gameplay with a spine-tingling atmosphere and a sense of urgency." And next to the Doom review are 2 previews of games that id Software were planning to release the year after in 1997. But in the end, only Hexen made it to the PS1 and was also very poorly received, due to its lower frame rate and poorer graphical fidelity. Mortal Kombat 3 also gets a 9 out of 10, with the writer stating that it improved upon Mortal Kombat 2 in almost every conceivable way. I really like how it introduces all the characters along the bottom here, it's really well laid out. Apparently, other than longer loading times, Mortal Kombat 3 didn't really differ from its original coin-op arcade machine. ESPN Extreme Games gets a 6 out of 10, citing unbalanced difficulty levels and too many similarities to Road Rash. The Tekken review is up next, and of course that gets a 9 out of 10. I should think so too with how much this magazine goes on about how it's revolutionised gaming. The magazine states, "Tekken is a joy to play. You really don't need to know any of the special moves to enjoy the game. Each of the joypad's 4 main buttons represents a limb, a tremendously progressive feature, and with just a few minutes practice you can soon give the opponent the old 1-2. The backgrounds aren't nearly as spectacular as Toshinden's, mainly because Tekken's are flat parallax, while the former has sublime solid 3D backdrops, again with the 3D. But Tekken is gloriously smooth and speedy, the animation's so slick that you barely pause to consider this to be a fault. Indeed, because Tekken is so superior in the playability stakes to Toshinden, such cosmetic vagaries are soon forgotten. And let's not nitpick, the locations ain't half bad, mum. Warhawk is an interesting one. This game found its resurgence in the early days of the PS3, with what some might consider a remake of sorts. It was a really good online game that I played quite a bit when I first got my PS3 online. Anyway, PSM gives the original Warhawk an 8 out of 10 and calls it a genuinely rewarding, thrilling action experience. Very, very tough, but well worth the investment in time, patience and lost sleep. Assault Rigs gets a 7 out of 10. Take some of the oldest game ideas in the world, throw in state-of-the-art 3D graphics, and you just might end up with this tanking good romp from Sony Interactive Entertainment. Because the rig-based Assault takes place indoors or within enclosed spaces, SIE has included an intelligent camera which constantly changes your viewpoint depending how close you are to a wall, but after a while you learn to despise this feature, which, as you bumble around the claustrophobic landscape, causes the scene to regularly zoom in and out like a bad 70s edition of Top of the Pops. Here's one I've actually been looking for quite a while, as it's one of the PlayStation's launch titles. It's a diagonally scrolling shooter called Viewpoint. Unfortunately though, it only manages to earn a 5 out of 10. Gameplay does leave something to be desired. Apart from the addition of a desperately needed passcode entry system, the painfully linear gameplay has remained intact. No hidden bits, no multiple routes, no special moves, just shooting, dodging and dying. Lots. Viewpoint is infuriatingly tricky. Despite being praised for its lush graphics, unfortunately Viewpoint only manages to earn a 5 out of 10. We saw a bit of this in the previous issue, but now comes a full review of WWF WrestleMania, and I have to say this game looks really interesting. I do want to play this one. A genuine contender on the beat-em-up circuit, not as accomplished as Mortal Kombat 3, but more hilariously entertaining than anyone would have expected. 8 out of 10. Rather controversial for its gory bits and crazy characters, the top-down shooter Loaded gets a 7 out of 10 from PSM. Reversing the trend for Doom-influenced clones, Gremlin revitalises an old formula with this explosive top-down perspective blaster. Using a package called Glow Art, Gremlin has been able to produce wonderfully vibrant explosions. The PlayStation 1 was definitely not short of football games, and this one from developer Rage in the UK got a 6 out of 10. Doesn't offer enough in the way of continuity to earn the title of Next Generation, but despite the flaws in gameplay, it does just about enough to entertain the gamer. This is the classic game of two halves. On one hand it looks fabulous and plays some nifty football, on the other it reveals fatal flaws in the gameplay. Another lesser known one here, Starblade Alpha from Namco. This is a first person space shooter by the looks of it, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Then there's Raiden, which gets a 7 out of 10 and is of course a port from the arcade version. Another scrolling shooter whose graphics were flat but apparently true to the arcade version. Now here's an interesting one, possibly the most dated game you're ever likely to play. It's Alone in the Dark, Jack is Back. and it gets an incredible 8 out of 10. New for the PlayStation, old on the PC. Does the Gaelic Adventures movie-like feel still impress, or is it just another ageing conversion? Well, it's certainly ageing now. Alone in the Dark's outstanding intro shows poor Ted Stryker making his way into the mansion, only to come a cropper when he's sliced by a belligerent fluffy toy, and for once the game actually looks and plays just like the intro sequence. PlayStation fan favourite and a game I've never actually played, Twisted Metal gets a 7 out of 10. It's an unoriginal concept and the graphics are crude, but this futuristic racer takes road rage to the nth degree. A couple of EA games now, PGA Tour 96 gets an 8 out of 10, and FIFA Soccer 96, wow, they were still calling it soccer, gets a 7 out of 10. Apparently this iteration of FIFA had very fiddly controls, and is nowhere near as well reviewed as some of the other football sim games that were covered in the magazine around this time, such as Goalstorm, which gets an 8 out of 10 and is coincidentally made by Konami, who later made the Pro Evolution Soccer series, which was in direct competition with FIFA for so many years. The next review is Worms from Team 17, and it gets a rather harsh 7 out of 10. I say this mainly because under originality they gave a 7 out of 10 and put "seen this before?" ? But I can't really think of any games that came out before Worms that were like Worms. The review makes comparisons to Lemmings, which I can kinda see from a superficial point of view, but certainly the game is completely different when you actually play it. Finally, there's a roundup of some really low scoring games, including Nova Storm, which I just played the demo for the previous video, and I did find it to be pretty terrible, to be honest. I actually thought I was playing it wrong at first, but I think it's more likely that the game just doesn't give you any indication of how to play it or whether you're doing well, or actually whether you're being hit. So that's it on the official UK PlayStation Magazine issue 2. We did of course have a bit more to cover in this episode because they had that month gap. Hope you enjoyed the video and please subscribe if you want more of the same.